Welcome to the Australian Christian Lobby's Voice for Values.
Welcome to Voice for Values. I'm Martyn Iles. Well, the day is fast approaching when we'll finally hear what the federal government's policy on religious freedom is. During last year's same-sex marriage campaign, this issue was discussed at length, including religious freedom for parents and the education of their kids, some free speech matters, particularly with the party entertainer Madeline being fired from her job for posting "It's okay to vote no" on Facebook, and the ongoing saga at that time of Archbishop Julian Porteous, who was before the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal, and various concerns about things like discrimination. What would it mean for people who have a dissenting view on marriage in a post-same-sex marriage Australia? Would they be able to continue to live in total freedom? All of this led the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to declare that he believes in religious freedom even more than he believes in same-sex marriage. But despite that, proposed religious freedom protections did not pass the Parliament when the law on marriage was changed, and rather the Ruddock Review was separately commissioned by the government to undertake a broader inquiry into religious freedom in Australia and come up with a response. Well, now the Ruddock Review is complete, and we're expecting its findings to be released any day now. And throughout this lengthy process, there have been several parliamentarians championing freedom and arguing for robust protections in our post-same-sex marriage society. And one of those politicians, I'm very pleased to say, is joining me today on Voice for Values to discuss this important issue. Liberal Senator from Victoria, James Paterson. Senator, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Martyn.
Senator, let's start by taking this nebulous term, religious freedom, and grounding it in something practical. What do we mean in this context when we say religious freedom? What sorts of things might be worth protecting, for example?
Well, I think we have to start from first principles here, and that is that we live in a pluralistic society where we have different values, and it's important that we're able to live alongside each other harmoniously. If my values and your values are different, that should not be a problem for us being neighbours. We should be able to go about our own lives happily and peacefully without trying to force one another to adopt our values. That's the kind of principle basis that I start from. So what's religious freedom in Australia? Well, there are two ways of thinking about religious freedom. There's a very narrow way of thinking about religious freedom, which some on the left like to hold, which is that you have a right to believe in your own head what you believe about your faith, but that's about it. And there's a broader definition of religious freedom, which I hold to, which is not only do you have a right to believe what you wish to believe, but you have a right to live your life according to those values, that you are able to manifest your religious belief out in the world. It's not just something which needs to be or should be contained in your head, but it is implicit in everything you do, that it is in your speech, it is in your actions, and for many people of faith, it will be impossible to live a life of integrity consistent with their faith if they couldn't act out on that faith in the real world.
Well, of course, it's a fairly artificial distinction, isn't it? I mean, if you were to limit someone's religious freedom to their thought life, it's not as if you can actually regulate someone's thought life anyway. So it becomes a very weak right indeed. So it's completely inconsistent with the whole idea of giving someone the freedom to live out their beliefs if you limit it to their brain.
That's right, exactly right. And that's one of the disturbing things about the left's view of religious freedom, that they don't understand that for people of faith, that there is no distinction, that they wouldn't be leading a life of integrity, they wouldn't be upholding their tradition and their faith if it was only something that they can contain within themselves. They want to, for example, raise their children within their religious tradition and pass their values on to them. They want to make sure that their actions in the world, whether that be at work or in study or in our communities, don't contradict what they believe and what they hear about in church on Sunday.
Which strikes me actually as a view of true diversity, because if you were to go down the line where it can be confined to your thought life, essentially you're actually got an enforced uniformity in the public square. Everybody has to leave their religious beliefs or whatever convictions at home and conform to some kind of collective way of being in the public square. That's not real diversity, is it? It's a weird kind of doublespeak going on there.
I agree with you completely, and it's very common on the left to talk about their love of diversity, but they're only interested in particular kinds of diversity. They're interested in the diversity of characteristics like race or gender or sexuality or age or disability or a whole other range of things, but they're not genuinely interested often in diversity of beliefs, on diversity of opinions, on diversity of perspectives. But of course, that's the richest thing about humanity, that we do hold different values, that we want to pursue our own lives according to those values, and every free society must uphold those, or we're not really a free society.
Some people would say, see, and I like where we're going here, because it actually expands this issue out to a whole range of things when we say belief, when we say opinion, when we say the way we speak, the way we live our lives, because there's many who would seek to say, well, religious freedom, well, that's just an issue for the overtly religious or the institutionally religious. That's not right, is it?
No, it's not. And we have to think about the history here. How did religious freedom come about and what did it lead to? Well, when we talk about freedom of speech or freedom of conscience, inherently when they were developed hundreds of years ago by people like John Locke, they were of religious nature. When he was talking about the freedom to speak and the freedom to believe, what he meant was, could Catholics disagree with Protestants? Could they be appointed to the organs of state? So our original concept of all of these freedoms actually comes from a religious context, and it's very hard to divorce them. It's very hard to say that you can have freedom of speech without having freedom of religion, or vice versa.
So the freedoms really all build upon each other, because if you're speaking, obviously you're speaking your beliefs, right? If you're associating around your beliefs, and therefore you find yourself not able really to get away from freedom of religion or belief, whatever you're doing.
Exactly. I think they hang or fall together. You either have a freedom to associate, as you say, and that means that you can choose what church you go to, you can choose who are members of your church, you can set criteria for that membership. Or if you don't have the freedom to do that, well, then how can you control how you worship at all? You can't have any control over that. So association, speech, belief, conscience, religion, they're all interlinked. And if you lose one, I think you lose all the others.
So it's perhaps fair to say then, do you think that to support freedom of religion is to support freedom itself, essentially?
Exactly. It is, I think, an intrinsic base freedom that we enjoy in the Western world, or have enjoyed in the Western world for hundreds of years. It underpins our pluralistic societies. It underpins our diverse societies and our tolerant societies. And if you're right, if you don't have this freedom, then I'm not sure what freedom you really have at all.
So that's interesting, because the way we're talking about this is to say that this really is a mark of tolerance, to say to people, look, you can hold these disparate beliefs and you can live in accordance with them on the whole without having your lives messed around with, or without suffering any kind of legal sanction for that. But so many of the arguments against religious freedom actually use the language of tolerance. So they say, well, if we allow your religious freedom, then you're going to go into the public square and you're going to say some people are wrong and some people are right, and that's just completely intolerant. How do you counter that narrative that we're apparently the intolerant ones?
Well, the left use the words tolerance, but they don't really mean tolerance. What they often mean is approval. Tolerance is a powerful virtue in a Western society, because despite the fact that we sometimes don't approve of how our fellow citizens live their lives or behave, we still nonetheless tolerate them. And that's the great strength of a Western society, is you don't have to approve of everyone else's lifestyle. You don't have to always approve of how they conduct it. But nonetheless, you recognise that they have a right to live their life according to their values, and you hope that they respect yours in turn. So when the left says we want tolerance, really what they're typically talking about is enforced approval. It's not just sufficient to say that you tolerate someone else. You have to also give them a big tick, give them an endorsement, and say that's a lifestyle that I aspire to, or that I think is a good one that I'm happy for my children to adopt. But that would not work at all for any length of time for a free society, because if we had to all approve of everyone else's lifestyle, we'll end up regulating ourselves so much that there'll be no diversity and no difference at all.
Look, Senator Paterson, let's just hold that thought right there. I'll be back right after the break and we'll continue the discussion.
Voice for Values at acl.org.au.
Welcome back to Voice for Values. I'm Martyn Iles, and today I am on the line with Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson to discuss the issue of religious freedom, especially in light of the impending release of the Ruddock Review and the announcement of the government's policy response. This is a really important issue for Christians. It's an important issue for people of faith. But as we were discussing before the break, it's an important issue for all Australians, because religious freedom and freedom of belief actually underlines all that we do as Australians, whether we are overtly religious or not. And we just finished at the end of the last section talking about what is true tolerance and discussing the fact that actually the allowance of plenary religious freedoms is in fact a mark of a tolerant society, allowing people to live out their beliefs according to their principles in all of their life. I wanted to turn this around now, Senator Paterson, and just talk about the direct context that we're in now with the Ruddock Review and with the same-sex marriage issue. What, if any, in your opinion, is there in terms of a connection between, say, the issue of same-sex marriage and the evolution of this discussion about religious freedom?
Well, my view is that it's an indirect link, and the reason why it's linked is because we've passed many laws in this country, particularly at the state level, in the anti-discrimination space, which unfortunately link these two things. Now, as you know, Martin, but your listeners might not know, I was someone who's always comfortable with the idea that same-sex couples should have the right to marry. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't affect my life if they choose to marry. But I never wanted them to be granted that freedom at the expense of other Australians' freedoms. And unfortunately, we have good reason to think that without sufficiently well-crafted laws, without sufficiently well-crafted protections, that will in fact happen, that it will come at the expense of other Australians' freedoms. And I think the most powerful example of that is the Julian Porteous case, which you mentioned earlier in the program, where a Archbishop of Tasmania, Catholic Archbishop of Tasmania, was hauled over calls at an anti-discrimination commission simply for sharing his church's teaching on marriage with his own parishioners. Now, if you can't safely talk about your own view about marriage according to your tradition, in this case a biblical tradition, without fear of legal recourse, well then you don't have religious freedom at all. And I'm profoundly disturbed by that, and that's something that has to be addressed in the Ruddock Review.
Of course, some people say, "Oh, well, he nothing came of it eventually." But of course, the process is the punishment, in the sense of just because he said that and the law came against him for a period of time, even though he never got any convictions or anything like that, that itself is a chilling effect on free speech around these issues.
Exactly. Anyone who saw the experience that he went through, saw the legal fees that he would have had to incur and the other discomfort of being named as someone who potentially violated anti-discrimination law in Tasmania, will be discouraged from speaking out. And for Archbishop Porteous himself, he now has a situation, because the complaint was withdrawn, that it is actually legally uncertain whether the pamphlet that he distributed on marriage can be lawfully distributed in Tasmania. We don't know, because the court has never tested that question. So it's actually profoundly unsatisfying that this was never dealt with legally, because we just don't know now. And I think we have to remove that doubt. We have to make sure that people know that it is safe to share your views about marriage, whether you are in favour of same-sex marriage or against it, in a state like Tasmania and indeed all around Australia.
Look, many of our listeners will know that Archbishop Porteous is symptomatic of a bit of a trend that's out there at the moment, which is, at ACL we've got a legal clinic that helps people who get in trouble with the law on similar issues, religious freedom grounds, and we've had 45 odd people that we've had to help because of situations like Archbishop Porteous, but just situations that weren't able to be publicised for various legal reasons. So, and as well as I do, that this is a mounting concern. Aside from the debate about same-sex marriage and the recent law change to the law on that, which hasn't had that much time actually to incubate and bear fruit, what other things do you think are taking place that are leading to this kind of environment, or this rising concern that these religious freedoms or freedoms associated with religious freedom are being cramped down on?
Well, one of the things that's raised most consistently with me by my constituents are things like in my home state of Victoria with the Safe Schools program, which is uncomfortable and inconsistent for many people with the values that they have as a family, whether they're religious values or just other values. And the disturbing situation for many parents in Victoria is that they haven't felt well informed about it. They haven't been notified that this kind of teaching is going to take place. They haven't been informed about the content of that teaching. They haven't been given the opportunity, if they wish, to remove their child from classes that have that kind of teaching. And in fact, Australia has signed many international agreements, one being the International Covenant on the Protection of the Rights of the Child, which says that parents have a right to control the moral and religious education of their children. So it's not a trivial concern at all that parents are able to have a say over when children are exposed to teaching of this nature, or if indeed they are exposed to it at all, if it isn't consistent with their family's values. So people raise that one with me very often.
So, that's one area of religious freedom that becomes immediately apparent. We've talked a little bit about free speech, or the Archbishop Porteous case. Then there's also concerns about discrimination, which come up with us very often in our legal clinic, where people suffer some kind of adverse action against them because they've declared their beliefs around this stuff. I understand that there was a number of amendments that were proposed to the change to the marriage law earlier this year, and those amendments actually canvassed a whole range of issues, including the ones we've just described. In your view, should we be aiming for something like that includes a plenary range of freedoms specifically directed to these beliefs?
I think so, although we have to be very careful with the drafting. So, as you say, Martin, myself and Senator David Fawcett proposed a series of amendments to the Dean Smith bill that subsequently did pass the Parliament to legalise same-sex marriage. They wouldn't have in any way stood in the path of legalisation of same-sex marriage, but they would have ensured that there were those robust protections for religious freedom, parents' rights, schools and charities. My hope is that the Ruddock Review addresses those gaps in the law and ensures that, for example, a charity which continues to advocate a traditional version of marriage can't lose its tax status, can't lose any public funding that it receives, that a public servant who openly professes their view in traditional marriage can't be dismissed on that basis, can't lose their job on that basis. So they're the kind of things that I hope are addressed. What I would be very cautious about, and I suspect you have a similar view, is a generic right to religious freedom that's not well specified, that's not well targeted, because ultimately that puts in the hands of courts decisions that I think the Parliament should be making, which is weighing up these really finely tuned, careful issues.
Of course, that was the beauty of some of those amendments, was that they were very, very specific. They went straight to, this is a protection of this particular belief in this particular context, whereas if you get generalised terminology around religious freedom, it just opens up a Pandora's box of where that could even lead, and I think rightly causes some people a great deal of concern. Can I just ask, there's really two processes here. One is the release of the Ruddock Review, I understand, and then the next one is the government's response to that. Are you hopeful that through that process there will actually be something quite substantial for religious freedom that will be offered up in terms of the policy outcomes, and what are the risks, do you think, around that?
Well, that's my hope, and that's certainly what I'm arguing for. And I think we have one very good reason to think that that will happen, and that is that during that amendments debate process last year on same-sex marriage, although they didn't pass the Parliament, they actually attracted the overwhelming support of the coalition party room. 89% of coalition MPs voted for at least one substantive amendment to the Marriage Act, and a majority, 52%, voted for every single proposed amendment to increase religious freedom. So it shows that within the coalition parties, the Liberal and National parties, there's very strong support for religious freedom and a very widespread acceptance of the inadequacy of the current protections. Our challenge, of course, is the Parliament. With a difficult Senate at the best of times and a narrow majority in the House of Representatives, getting legislation through which is in any way contentious in the community is a difficult thing to achieve. So we have to be able to bring the community with us. We have to be able to persuade the crossbench that these reforms are necessary and worthy of support. I mean, I would hope that some of the reforms would be supported by the Labor Party, but I certainly don't hold out hope that the Greens would support it, and ultimately we'll have to see what kind of shape they take.
Well, Senator Paterson, I know that the listeners will be encouraged by the news about the Coalition Party room that you've just shared. And I just personally also want to say thanks very much for your advocacy and for your tireless stand for freedom. So thanks very much for joining us today on Voice for Values.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Martyn.
Voice for Values from the Australian Christian Lobby at acl.org.au.